I never should have gone back to Ashwood Forest. That place wasn't right. Not in the way people whisper about haunted houses or abandoned hospitals, but in a way that felt wrong on a fundamental level. Like a piece of reality had come loose and was hanging by a thread, waiting for someone to tug. And I did. God help me, I did. It started with a trip, a simple weekend hiking trip, just like the dozens I had taken before. The plan was straightforward. Head upstate, spend a couple of nights at the Twin Pines campground, and explore some of the lesser-known trails. I liked the solitude. The further from civilization I got, the better. The woods have a way of pressing in around you, making the world small, simple. Out there, life is just movement, breath, and the occasional crunch of a twig underfoot. I packed light, enough food for 3 days, a tent, a GPS, and a few other essentials. I had marked a handful of trails I wanted to explore, but I wasn't opposed to straying off course. That was the whole point, discovering something new, and I did. The first day was uneventful. I set up camp near a lake and spent the evening watching the fire, listening to the distant hoots of owls, the rustling of unseen creatures in the brush. The second day, I decided to push further into the woods. That's when I found it. It wasn't on my map. It wasn't on any map. A narrow path, half overgrown but unmistakably deliberate, winding away from the main trail like a forgotten secret. There was something odd about it. No trail markers, no signs of human activity, no footprints or tire tracks. It should have been nothing. Just another deer path, another forgotten game trail. But it wasn't. The moment I stepped onto it, everything changed. The air felt thicker, like wading into a pool, just a little too deep. The sounds of the forest dimmed, as if muffled by something unseen. I should have turned back. I should have listened to the primal instinct clawing at the back of my mind. But I was curious, and curiosity is a dangerous thing. The trail led deeper into the trees, winding in a way that felt unnatural. I checked my GPS. The signal flickered, then vanished altogether. Not unusual, but still unsettling. I pressed on. The deeper I went, the stranger things became. The trees were wrong. Their bark was too smooth, their branches twisted in ways that made my stomach churn. The shadows stretched just a little too long. And the silence. The silence was the worst part. No birds, no insects, just the sound of my own breathing, my own footsteps crunching against the earth. It felt like the woods were watching me. After what felt like hours, I found something. A clearing, though the word didn't feel right. It was an absence of trees rather than a proper clearing, as if something had erased them rather than cut them down. The ground was barren, save for a single object in the center. A signpost. It was old, the wood warped and cracked, but the lettering was clear. Burned into the wood in deep, uneven strokes. The trail ends here. I stared at it, my mind refusing to process the meaning. The trail didn't end here. It kept going. I could see it, a thin ribbon of dirt cutting into the trees beyond. And yet the sign insisted. Something about it filled me with a quiet, creeping dread. I reached out, running my fingers over the letters, feeling the deep grooves. The wood was warm, not from the sun. It was a different kind of warmth, like the last embers of a dying fire. I pulled my hand back. The air had changed again. Thicker. I could feel it pressing against my skin, wrapping around me like unseen fingers. I should have left. I should have turned around right then and there. But I didn't. I stepped past the sign and kept walking. The further I went, the less real the world felt. The trees seemed taller, their branches interwoven like grasping hands. The ground became uneven, the roots twisting up like veins beneath cracked skin. And the silence, God, the silence became absolute. Then the whispers started. At first, I thought it was the wind, a faint rustling, like dry leaves brushing together. But there was no wind, and the whispers weren't coming from the trees. They were coming from beneath me. I stopped walking. The ground felt unsteady, like something was shifting below the surface. My breath came fast and shallow. My hands trembled. Slowly, I crouched down, pressing my palm against the dirt. Something moved. It was subtle, a vibration more than anything, but I felt it. A pulse, faint but undeniable, like the slow, steady beat of a distant drum. The earth beneath me was breathing. A cold, nauseating terror crept through my veins. I turned around, forcing my legs to move, to run. But the trail behind me had changed. The trees had closed in, the path twisting in ways I didn't recognize. My footprints were gone, and the sign, the one that had warned me to turn back, was nowhere to be seen. I was trapped, and the trail wasn't finished with me yet. Panic clawed its way up my throat, but I swallowed it down. This was just disorientation. I had gotten turned around, that's all. I forced myself to breathe, to think. The worst thing I could do was start running blindly. I pulled out my phone. No signal. I checked my GPS again, hoping that maybe, just maybe, it had reconnected. Nothing. The screen flickered strangely before going dark. That wasn't right. The battery had been nearly full when I left camp. I turned slowly, taking in my surroundings. The trees loomed taller now, their trunks stretching upward like skeletal fingers. The bark looked cracked, almost burned, and the shadows between them were too dark. Not just nighttime dark, but an absence of light, as if something had erased the space between the branches. I had to move. Staying still wasn't an option. I picked a direction and walked, trying to stay calm. The path wasn't as clear now, but I could still see traces of it, scattered stones, a break in the undergrowth. It had to lead somewhere. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time felt strange here, like it was stretching and folding in on itself. My steps grew heavier, each footfall dragging against the earth. Then I saw it, a cabin, just ahead, nestled between the trees. A small wooden structure, its windows dark, its roof sagging. A single lantern flickered on the porch, casting long, dancing shadows. Relief surged through me. Maybe someone was inside. Maybe they could help. But as I stepped closer, the whispers returned. Louder this time. Urgent. And I realized something that made my breath catch in my throat. The cabin had no door, and the lantern wasn't flickering. It was pulsing, like a heartbeat, like the ground beneath me. And then something knocked from the inside. I didn't move. I couldn't. The knock, 3 hollow thuds, echoed from inside the cabin, too deliberate to be the wind, too rhythmic to be anything but intentional. My breath hitched in my throat. My pulse slammed in my ears. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to obey. Another knock, louder this time. The lantern above the porch pulsed again, the dim glow shivering like something was breathing inside it. I took a step back, and as my foot crunched against the dirt, the entire cabin groaned, not the sound of it settling, but something alive, stretching, shifting, acknowledging my presence. The door wasn't there. It hadn't been there when I first saw the cabin, and yet, as I stared, something opened. A doorway that hadn't existed a moment ago now gaped at me, revealing absolute darkness beyond its frame. No hinges creaked, no wind stirred the air. It was just there, waiting, and then something stepped out. Not all at once. The first thing to emerge was a hand, long, thin fingers curling around the edge of the doorway, skin too pale, too smooth. The fingernails were wrong, extending just a little too far beyond the tips, tapering into sharp, uneven points. Then came the arm, impossibly thin, moving with an unnatural grace. I was already backing away, my legs finally breaking free from their paralysis. I should have turned, should have bolted into the woods, direction be damned. But I didn't. I couldn't, because then I saw its face. It didn't emerge like a person stepping forward. It unfolded like something trying to remember how to move like a human. The head lolled to one side, then the other, like a marionette's strings had been cut. Its face wasn't right. At first glance, it looked human. 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth. But then my brain caught up with what I was actually seeing. The proportions were off, the eyes were too wide, the pupils too large, swallowing almost all of the sclera. The nose was shallow, barely formed, as if someone had sculpted it in wet clay and never finished. The mouth, God, the mouth, too wide, too empty. The thing cocked its head at me, as if considering something. Its jaw trembled, then unhinged with a sickening pop, splitting open in a way that should have shattered bone. But there was no bone, just a gaping void of darkness. And then it screamed. Not a sound, a feeling, a pressure inside my skull, in my teeth, in my bones. It was like something was pushing against reality itself, pressing into my mind, forcing me to acknowledge its presence in ways I couldn't comprehend. I stumbled backward, my ears ringing, my vision darkening at the edges. The forest around me seemed to warp, the trees bending, their forms shifting, as if the world itself was coming apart at the seams. I turned and ran, blindly, recklessly. My feet barely felt the ground as I tore through the trees, branches whipping my arms, my legs, my face. The thing behind me didn't chase. It didn't have to. The whispering was back, louder now, no longer coming from beneath the earth. It was inside me, fragments of words, pieces of voices. Some I recognized, my mother, my father, voices of people I hadn't thought of in years, speaking in a broken, disjointed chorus. Come back. You don't belong here. It's not finished with you. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The voices weren't coming from outside. They were echoing inside my skull. I had to keep moving. I had to, and then I wasn't. I didn't trip. I didn't fall. One moment I was running. The next I was somewhere else. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Damp wood, rotten leaves, a faint, metallic tang that sent ice down my spine. I blinked. I was inside the cabin. The door I had never walked through was behind me, sealed shut. The air was thick, heavy, pressing against my skin like unseen hands. The walls were wrong. They weren't made of wood. Not really. The texture was off, too smooth, too dark. I reached out hesitantly, fingers grazing the surface, and a shudder crawled through me. It wasn't wood. It was something else, something pulsing beneath my touch, something alive. And the whispering hadn't stopped. It was clearer now, the words forming properly, no longer a fragmented mess. You see now, You've always seen. We remember you. I spun around, searching for the source, but the room was empty. Just a single table in the center. And on that table, a journal. Old, its pages yellowed with age, the leather cover cracked and worn. It looked familiar. My breath hitched as I stepped closer, my fingers hovering over the cover. I recognized it. I had seen it before. Not in my hands, not in my possessions, but in a dream. I opened it. The handwriting was frantic, uneven, scrawled in thick black ink. If you are reading this, it's already too late. My stomach twisted. The words blurred for a moment, then sharpened. The trail doesn't exist, but it finds you. It always finds you. I turned the page. More desperate scribbles. There is no leaving. You think you escape, but you don't. It brings you back. It makes you forget. It rewrites the path. A date was scribbled in the corner. My own handwriting. It was today's date. My hand shook. My breath came in ragged gasps. I flipped forward page after page until I reached the final entry. You have walked this trail before. You will walk it again. The void is waiting. The whispering grew louder. The walls shuddered. And behind me a single knock. Then another. Then another. Something was in here with me. And the last thing I saw before everything collapsed into darkness was the doorway. And something stepping through it. The knock came again. Louder this time. I couldn't move. The journal in my hands felt heavier now, like it was sinking into my skin, anchoring me in place. My breath came in short, sharp gasps, my vision tunneling as the shadows in the cabin shifted. The doorway yawned open before me, but there was nothing beyond it. No trees, no light, no sky, just void. The knock came a third time, but now I realized something. It wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from inside me. Something pounded within my ribs, rattling through my bones like an answer to the thing standing in the dark. I tried to move, to breathe, to scream, but I had been here before. I had always been here. The journal slipped from my hands. It landed on the wooden floor, but the sound it made wasn't right. It wasn't a dull thud of paper and leather. It was a splash. My eyes darted downward, and my stomach twisted violently. The floor wasn't wood anymore. It was wet. Dark liquid seeped up through the cracks, spreading outward in slow, pulsing ripples. It smelled wrong, like damp earth, like decay, like something ancient. I stepped back, and then the floor sank beneath me. I didn't fall. I plunged. Down, 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 through blackness so thick it felt like water pressing against my skin, wrapping around me like a living thing. My lungs burned. My ears rang with a whispering, no longer just voices, but something deeper, something older than language. And then I stopped, not like hitting the ground, like being placed. The air rushed back into my lungs as I staggered forward, my boots splashing against something cold and shallow. My heart hammered against my ribs as I took in my surroundings. A corridor, not in a house, not in a cave, but something in between. The walls pulsed like muscle, their surfaces damp and uneven. A thick mist clung to the ground, swirling around my ankles, carrying with it the faint echo of footsteps, mine, but also not mine. Something was ahead of me. I didn't want to go forward, but I didn't want to stay here either. I walked. Each step sent ripples through the mist, distorting the space around me, making the corridor seem longer, deeper, endless. I didn't know if I was walking for seconds or hours, but eventually the corridor ended. and I was somewhere else. At first, I thought I was outside. The space stretched infinitely in every direction, but there were no walls, no ceiling, no sky. Just a void of swirling black, like ink suspended in water. My breath came in ragged gasps as I turned in circles, searching for an exit, for a path, and then I saw them. Silhouettes. Dozens. Maybe hundreds. Standing just beyond the reach of my vision, barely more than outlines in the darkness. Their forms flickered and shivered, their edges melting like candle wax, shifting like they were struggling to hold a shape. They weren't moving. They were watching. And then, one step forward, the others followed, a slow, rippling advance, their bodies distorting with each step, the space around them warping as if reality itself was recoiling from their presence. A sound built in my throat, a broken, gasping whimper. My legs twitched, ready to run, but my body locked in place. The leading figure reached the edge of the darkness, and I saw its face. It was me, but not. The features were almost identical. Same nose, same mouth, same hollowed-out eyes. But the skin was wrong. The texture was smooth, too smooth, like a mask stretched too tight over a skull that wasn't meant to wear it. Its lips peeled back, revealing teeth that weren't teeth, just an endless, black void where a mouth should have been. And then it spoke. Not aloud, not in words, but inside me. You are remembering. The whispering in my head surged, overlapping, voices layering upon voices. You were here before. You left. You tried. You will always return. I clamped my hands over my ears, shaking my head violently. No, I rasped. No, this can't be real. The figure moved closer. This is real. The trail doesn't end. It loops. I stumble backward. The void around me shifted, the space tilting, the darkness pulsing like a heartbeat. The silhouettes in the distance shuddered. Some flickered out of existence, only to reappear closer. You have walked this path before, and you will again. I felt it then. A pull, like invisible hands wrapping around my ribs, dragging me backward. I struggled, clawed at the air, but there was nothing to hold on to. The corridor was gone. The silhouettes were gone. The void yawned open beneath me, a gaping, pulsing mouth waiting to swallow me whole. I screamed. And then I was falling again. I gasped, choking on my own breath as I slammed against the dirt. My fingers dug into the ground, my body convulsing with raw terror. My surroundings came into focus. Trees. The forest. I was back. The trail stretched before me, exactly as it had before. The air was thick, humid, the scent of damp earth curling in my lungs. The trees loomed tall, their branches knotted together like skeletal hands. And there, the signpost. The trail ends here. I scrambled to my feet, my pulse hammering. I turned, expecting to see the path behind me, the one I had walked before, but there was nothing. Just more trees, more forest, no cabin, no void, no way back. I reached for my pocket, my fingers trembling. My journal was still there. I yanked it out, flipping frantically through the pages, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The writing was still there. The entries were still mine. And at the very bottom of the last page, a new line had appeared. The trail doesn't end. It begins again. I wasn't alone. The whispers had never stopped. And as I stood there, beneath the tangled canopy, the shadows around me moved. The path ahead shifted, and I knew I had never left. I had just started over. I stared at the words in my journal, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The trail doesn't end. It begins again. My hands trembled. The pages felt warmer than they should have been, like the journal itself was alive. I slammed it shut. No, I had escaped. I had woken up here. This was the real world. The trees around me were real. The dirt beneath my boots was real. The sky overhead, pale and overcast, was real. And yet the air felt wrong. Still, too still. Not a single breeze moved the branches. The leaves didn't rustle. Even my own breath felt like it wasn't mine. I turned in place. The forest was too perfect. The trees, though gnarled and ancient, repeated the same crooked branches, the same patches of moss, like a looping background in an old cartoon. My stomach twisted violently. I took a step forward, heart hammering. The dirt beneath my boot sank slightly, softer than it should have been. I crouched down and pressed my fingers to the ground. It wasn't dirt. It was flesh. I yanked my hand back, ball rising in my throat. The trail, the forest, it wasn't just trapping me. It was alive, and it was watching. A whisper curled through the trees. Keep walking. I spun around. No one was there. But the path. It was different now. It didn't stretch ahead in a straight line. It curved, winding deeper into the trees, bending in on itself like something organic. I tried to step backward, but there was no way back. The forest behind me had changed. Where the trees had once stood, there was now only blackness. Not shadows, not night. A void, a hole in reality. I was trapped, and I knew then there was no escape. The only way was forward. So I walked. The farther I went, the worse it became. The trees began to decay. Their bark peeled away in long, curling strips, revealing something wet underneath. The ground grew softer, pulsing faintly with each step. The whispering didn't stop. You've always been here. You never left. You never will. The voices weren't random anymore. They were familiar. Some were my own. Some were my mother's. Some belonged to people I had forgotten long ago. And then the cabin appeared, exactly where it had been before. No, this was wrong. I had left this place. I had fallen through it, woken up outside. But the door was open. A figure stood inside. Me. I froze. The other me stepped forward barefoot, his skin pale and waxy. His eyes were wrong, too large, too hollow. His face an unfinished version of my own. You know the truth now. I staggered back. No, I choked out. You're not real. I am. I always was. The figure's mouth peeled back into a grin. But there were no teeth, no tongue, just an empty, gaping void inside his skull. I was the first. I shook my head violently, my pulse a frantic drumbeat in my ears. What do you mean? I whispered. The first version of you. The whispering around me grew louder, a chorus of overlapping voices, versions of me, speaking in a broken, endless loop. The first time you walked the trail, you died, but it didn't let you go. My throat closed. My hands trembled. I stepped forward. No, I rasped. I'm still alive. Not the first you. The cabin shuddered. The walls rippled like something breathing. There have been others. I looked down at my hands. They were shaking. No, they were changing. My fingers looked softer, my skin smoother, too smooth, too perfect, like something recently formed. I sucked in a sharp breath. Memories rushed back, Not just my own, but others. Versions of me, walking this trail, reaching this place, dying here, only to wake up and start again. I clutched my skull, nails digging into my scalp. How many times? I whispered. The other me smiled wider, his jaw splitting apart with a sickening crack. Forever. I had never left. I had never left. The realization slammed into me like a hammer, knocking the breath from my lungs. The trail. The void. It didn't kill me. It copied me. Every time I walked the path. Every time I reached the cabin. Every time I died. A new version of me was created. One that woke up back on the trail, thinking it was the first, thinking it was real. The forest around me shivered, the trees peeling away, revealing endless copies of myself. Some were walking the path. Some were watching from the trees. Some were stuck in the void, frozen mid-scream, their mouths gaping wide in endless, soundless terror. And I was just one of them. I wasn't the first. I wouldn't be the last. The forest shifted. The trees melted away, revealing only darkness. The path beneath my feet unraveled, the ground peeling back like wet paper, revealing the pulsing, living flesh beneath. The whispers grew louder. Keep walking. It's time. You will be replaced. My vision blurred. My limbs felt heavier. I stumbled forward, knees buckling, my body disintegrating piece by piece. My skin peeled away in soft, curling ribbons. My bones dissolved into dust. My mind unraveled, memories bleeding into the void, becoming part of the endless cycle. And as I collapsed into the darkness, I saw it, the next version of me, standing at the trailhead, looking down at the sign, reading the words for the first time. The trail ends here, but it never really ended. It only began again.